Thank you. Distinguished members of Congress, representative of Nagorno Karabakh, representatives of the Armenian Embassy, Armenian community, honorable and invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Astvatsaturian Turcotte, and I live in Portland, Maine. A little over 2 years ago, in this very building, I made my very first statement on the events that destroyed my childhood and changed the trajectory of my life. The response to my first statement and to my eventual worldwide book tour has been overwhelming. I was born in Armenian in the city of Baku, Azerbaijan. Armenians were minorities in the largely Muslim Republic of Azerbaijan. However, we had a peaceful, happy childhood. But things changed in 1988, soon after I turned 10. The Soviet Union began its collapse, and the facade of tolerance began to fade. Life as we knew it for myself, my family, and hundreds of our friends ceased to exist as violent gangs stormed our streets and attacked us and killed us for simply being Armenian. At first it was very gradual, and then it became organized. They knew our addresses. Not only was I confused as a child, seeing this violence suddenly surging on the streets against my people and against children, but my parents were shocked as well. This cannot be happening in a civilized metropolis of Baku. I began keeping a diary to call my thoughts. This diary is really my book, Nowhere, A Story of Exile. Through glimpses of news and my parents' fearful talks, I understood that Nagorno Karabakh was fighting for its independence, the beautiful Armenian land within Azerbaijani control that was artificially imposed, finally voiced their, through a referendum, finally voiced their will to separate from Azerbaijan. Through this referendum, the freedom movement of other Soviet republics were sparked. They've endured 70 years of intolerant Azerbaijani rule, and finally, they began their rightful purpose for freedom. This freedom movement was really the reason why we became targeted in the city of Baku, the capital. The Azerbaijani government was enraged to lose this once gifted by Stalin piece of land. They wanted to scare Karabakh into submission. In Baku, we spent months either hiding in the dark with curtains closed, or equally terrified, surrounded by Russian tanks that were only there to stop the Azerbaijani independence movement and not to protect us. We never knew when we could be attacked, when the demonstrations against us would resume. Going to school became terrifying, and there were days, sometimes weeks, we didn't leave our home. My face and my name, so very Armenian, became terrifying. Even as an adult, hearing an Azerbaijani speech for the first time in 20 years in Washington, D.C., in the United States of America, my first reaction was to hide my face. Just like my father taught me on the streets of Baku. Just tell them you're a Greek if they ever ask you, he told me. This fear is still ingrained in me at 36 years old, and I detest it. I fight against it by speaking it out loud, just as I'm doing it right now. Children in my school soon after began to repeat their parents' genocidal comments. The security and stability of my life that my parents worked so hard to build was destroyed. I witnessed violence and intolerance toward innocent Armenians with my own eyes and with my own body, a body of an 11-year-old girl. Baku was no longer our home. Baku was a nightmare. We had to flee. Hundreds of thousands had to flee. Some left bruised, beaten with nothing in the middle of the night in their nightgowns. But with everything we've seen, my family was the lucky ones. We left just a few months before the mass atrocities, the organized atrocities began. My family friends have no pictures of their childhood because the entire family was thrown out of their homes, beaten in the middle of the night, and put on a boat to Turkmenistan. My best friend's mother and grandmothers died during the pogroms. He was 11 years old and miraculously survived. My uncle was beaten and survived simply because a neighbor hit him. The graves of my grandparents in Baku are no longer there because all the Armenian cemeteries were demolished. And I actually Googled Earthed it, and there's a parking lot over my grandparents. The Armenian church I treasured visiting as a child was set ablaze. Now, as an adult and as a mother, I fully comprehend the suffering my parents had endured in Baku, and later as refugees. And only for being Armenian, for being Christian, for being a minority, and for being powerless. Due to the earthquake, the blockade, and the war with Azerbaijan, Armenia's lack of resources to provide for the flood of hundreds of thousands of refugees, the life for refugees was extremely difficult. During this time in my family's life, Karabakh Armenians were suffering even worse. They were fighting a brutal war for independence and decolonization of their ancestral lands. They were fighting this battle even now, 25 years later. Their borders are constantly fired upon, despite the ceasefire agreement signed by Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan continuously violates it. They shoot at kindergartens on the border. They pass laws that it's lawful to shoot civilian aircraft in the Karabakh airspace. Karabakh civilians live on the border, are very vigilant and constantly on edge of numerous civilian kidnappings and murders. People of Karabakh, every one of them, is a hero. Many Baku Armenian survivors live in Karabakh. After everything they've endured, they moved to Karabakh to support their independence. Baku Armenians, some of them joined here today, are American citizens too. They live all over the world. And we want to see the same type of freedoms we have in Europe and the United States and all over the world for people of Karabakh. Just this past September, I visited Karabakh on my first official visit. The place which started the change in trajectory of my life. It's a center of all the things I hold dear to my heart and what makes me an Armenian. We make things flourish. We create, we rebuild, we survive, and we persevere. Nagorno Karabakh is flourishing from what I've seen with its limited resources, with the closed borders, with security concerns, with all the problems that they have with the refugees. Road by road, building by building, family by family, they're rebuilding. Their children have never lived anywhere but a free Karabakh, with a democratically elected, transparent, and effective government. They live with no fear of being Armenian. Their only fear is the hostile border with Azerbaijan that takes Armenian lives with an alarmingly increasing rate. Azerbaijan claims Karabakh and Armenia want the existing hostility and war. Why would they? Armenian land has been reclaimed by their rightful citizens through a lawful referendum, and then a bloody war that left almost every man in Karabakh that I met wounded, and every family mourning a lost soldier. But Nagorno-Karabakh can only benefit from peace in this situation. It is Azerbaijan that has something to gain from the hostility from war, the border violence and violations of ceasefire. If not for the land they want to reclaim, it's the destruction of their citizens away from the actual internal problems that they have in Azerbaijan. Problems which are ranging from human rights abuses against dissenters and journalists, and economic issues that they're facing with internally in Azerbaijan. While at the same time, their leadership is lining their pockets with the money that belongs to the people of Azerbaijan. Meanwhile, in Nagorno-Karabakh, the people stayed vigilant. They continue to build, to grow, and to be a democratic model for all of the region to emulate, while protecting their children from the very violence I saw against Armenians in Baku. I could not wish for my experience on anyone, let alone a fellow Armenian. And surely my experience will be replicated in Karabakh, if ever it becomes within the confines of Azerbaijan. I can guarantee you that. Baku Armenian communities around the world, and especially in the United States, stand with you, Karabakh. May you children never have to be subjected to Azerbaijani rule. May you never hide in the dark like we did, fearing for our lives in Baku. May you proudly display your Armenian names and culture and Armenian flag. Proudly, just like I do in my adoptive land, my adoptive home, United States of America. I celebrate your accomplishments by traveling around the world and telling my story. In every audience I visit, there is one or two Baku Armenians with a horror story of their own, and they support you. The hope for a peaceful resolution of this conflict is very fragile. Karabakh must continue building, rebuilding, and dreaming despite the mounting tensions. It must continue exactly as it has been doing toward transparency, freedom, and eventual recognition. Until then, and for the rest of my life, I will stand in full dedication and commitment to the people of Karabakh, telling my very difficult story of Azerbaijani government's brutal massacres against my people in Baku, Sumgait, Kirovabad, Maraga, and others. We celebrate Karabakh's achievements, we honor our dead 25 years later, and with its peace, with its people, for peace, for freedom, and right to live on their motherland without fear. Thank you.